Hi everyone, my name is Carolyn, and on behalf of Kingston Libraries, a very warm welcome to our special event tonight. I would like to begin on behalf of Kingston Council and the Kingston community to acknowledge all the traditional owners of the lands that we are all remotely situated on today, and all elders past and present, as well as recognise their enriched knowledge and wisdom of the land we all call Australia. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce Fiona. We will take questions, but they will be at the end of the presentation. And to ask a question, we ask that you go to slido.com, which is slido.com, and then type in the code 64659 and type your question. Now that information is also up on the YouTube chat wall for you to follow. Also, just to let you know that we will be recording the session tonight. So that's just a bit of housekeeping. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you Fiona Lowe. She's a best-selling author. To tell you a little bit about Fiona, she grew up in Papua New Guinea, where in the absence of TV, books were the entertainment, and that's what engendered a lifelong love of reading and books in Fiona. She uses her experiences as a midwife and family support worker, amongst other things, to write books about families and relationships. Fiona is a recipient of the prestigious USA Rita Award and the Australian Ruby Award. Her stories are set in small towns and they deal with family ties and relationships and how these impact on the decisions that people make in life. Fiona's latest book is Just an Ordinary Family, and you can download that from Kingston's Library's Borrow Box e-collection. So in her talk tonight, Fiona is going to talk about her journey to becoming a writer and to provide some tips on how you can turn your passion into a career. So once again, a very warm welcome, and over to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Hello, everyone. I just want to give a bit of a big shout out to everyone in Melbourne. You are doing it hard up there in stage 4. I'm in regional Victoria, stage 3, and not a huge difference, but I have a little bit more flexibility, even though I don't leave the house terribly much. I think knowing that I can it does help. So thinking of you on Are You OK Day. So as Caroline said, I learnt to read in Papua New Guinea, but we did return to Australia when I was 8, and I actually lived in the city of Kingston. It was Moorabbin then, but I used to use the Cheltenham Library, so my teenage years were spent borrowing books from the library. So it's nice to be back chatting to you. So I'm going to have chat to you about my journey, as Caroline said, and then give you some tips. I've got a little bit of a presentation. It's, we've only got 45 minutes before questions, so it's not a writing course by any stretch of the imagination, but I will certainly hope to give you some building blocks that you can then go on to build on. So I didn't actually have the usual writer's journey story like a lot of authors. I was the avid reader, and you can't be a writer without being a reader. Reading comes first. But I didn't scribble stories as a kid, but looking back, I did have lots of long conversations in my head with imaginary characters. I also come from a family of letter writers. My grandmother came out to Australia in 1929 to marry my grandfather, who she'd met in England and hadn't seen for a whole year. And she used to write home to England every week. And then when we went to Papua New Guinea every Sunday afternoon, Mum would pull out the little green Olivetti portable typewriter and would write home. And then I was an exchange student, and so I was in Canada and was expected to write home every week because long-distance phone calls were very expensive. And that was in the back of the day of the blue aerogram, and you wrote on it and then you turned it over and you always had way more news than you had left. So, yeah, letters have been a big part of life. And when I was living in America, with my husband, and we were up to email by then, and people used to say to me, you should write a travel book, you should, your descriptions. And I was like, oh, no, I'm not really all that interested in that. So, but when I was 15, my mother gave me a copy of Pride and Prejudice, and that is a story, love of my life, that book. I was 15, so it was perfect timing. And I became addicted to the happy ending. I really loved the way it made me feel. And I can still remember, because the process went pretty much like this. She handed me this beautiful MLC leather-bound prize copy with tissue paper when we were camping in the dirt at Wilson's prom, and had run out of books, and she said, read this. And I started reading, and I said, oh, this is so boring. And she said, keep reading. And then I went, that horrible Mr. Darcy. And she said, keep reading. And then it was like, oh, Mr. Darcy. So that was my introduction to a happy ending. But I continued to read wildly. And then as a joke on my 30th birthday, because I did nursing and midwifery and community health, and as a joke on my 30th birthday, I was given a little book that was called A Medical Romance. And it took me back to the flying doctors and country practice of my youth, and in the nurses' home, how we would rush on a Thursday night to watch the flying doctors, and the key was to diagnose the patient before they did the reveal. And it was an easy read, and it was very enjoyable. And I thought, well, I could write something like that. Just because it was easy to read, had to be easy to write, right? No, does not work like that. And then I got really busy with my career, and I didn't think anything more about writing a book. But today I'm talking to you about having just started my 36th novel. So how did that happen? So hopefully you can see a slide there with my latest 4 books on it. So as I'm going to tell you my story tonight as it pertains to the hero's journey. And the hero's journey is a storytelling structure, and almost every best-selling novel or super successful movie uses this structure. So I think Star Wars, The Princess Bride, Avatar, Gone with the Wind, Pride and Prejudice. And the hero's journey is something to become very familiar with if you want to write a kick-ass story. So here it is. So the hero's journey, as it pertains to me, is that I was at home with a new baby. So it took looking at the top to the call of adventure. I was at home with a new baby, and it had taken 7 years and a lot of emotional and financial trauma to get pregnant. So I was trying to avoid returning to full-time work. And I was listening to ABC Radio, and they were interviewing a publisher, and I thought, that's what I will do, stay at home and write books. And that was my call to adventure. Now, in a novel, the protagonist can cheerfully walk into the adventure, but in the best stories, the protagonist is usually reluctant and has to be dragged into it kicking and screaming. So think Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, or Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, and Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice. So I accepted the call, and I stepped off a cliff without a harness. I knew absolutely nothing. I didn't even know how to format a Word document. We did have a computer. It was pretty new. But I did remember that medical romance that I had read a few years earlier, and I knew about medicine. And the publisher on the interview had said, right, so I was pegging out the nappies. I came up with a plot idea, and off I went. And it was super exciting, and it was really exhilarating. And I dashed off 3 chapters, and I posted it to London. Yeah, that was before email. And the day I posted these first 3 chapters, my husband came home and said, there's a job in America. And 3 weeks later, we were there. And I didn't have a computer, and I didn't have a typewriter. And another 3 months later, my mother forwarded me a letter from London, and it said, we really like your voice. We'd love to see the rest of the manuscript. It's like, oh, great. It's not actually written. So it took me a year to finish that book. And during that time, I joined a writers group where I met mentors and helpers. And then I went on to face a series of challenges. I had absolutely no idea what a scene was or a sequel. I didn't know about point of view, and I didn't have a good understanding of what conflict was. So I did some writing workshops, and I joined a critique group, which turned out to be the best and the worst thing that happened to me. And I'll talk about that in a bit. And I sent off the manuscript, and, of course, it was rejected, and I tumbled into the abyss, or often referred to as a metaphorical death in the hero's journey. So it was the dark moment. Things weren't good. So I wrote a second novel, and the writing teacher tore the start apart and told me that I should do A, B and C, which I dutifully did because I wanted to get published. But that too was a very unwise decision, because what I was writing was not a natural fit for me, what she thought I should do. It might have been a natural fit for her, but not for me. But what it did teach me was how to edit. So I sent the book off, and a year later it was rejected. And then we moved back to Australia, and we had another baby, and 3 years went by, and I met an author at a workshop, a local workshop that I'd seen advertised in the paper, and the baby was 3 by then. I said, I'd like to go to this. So I toddled off, and it was at that workshop that this published author told me that my 2-page rejection letters that I had been receiving from London weren't actually a flat-out no. They were what they referred to as an invitation to resubmit. But, of course, I just had read it's not suitable at this time. And she said, if they don't want your book, they write it, we don't want it. So I went back, and there was a lot of heartache and a lot of despair. We're still on challenges. On the other side of the abyss, more challenge. And, of course, that book was also rejected. So by then I was at the transformation point. I had never failed at anything academic until this point, and I got really steely determined that this was not going to defeat me. So I read what was popular in the genre I was trying to write. I read the books by the authors that I enjoyed the most, and don't die, I highlighted the conflicts, and I highlighted the bits that really sang, to try and learn from that and to work out what I was doing wrong, and to get my head around the conflict. So I analysed, and those lessons turned me into a real writer. The 4th book I wrote and submitted, I got a phone call, and I was very excited. I thought it was the call, but it wasn't. It was the "you're almost there but" phone call. And the editor said to me, we really like it, but there seems at times that your voice just disappears. And remember I talked about that critique group? Yeah, so what happens was their voices were getting into my work, and that can happen with critique groups. And when you're early in the process, I certainly didn't recognise that I was prepared to do just about anything to get published, but actually I'd shot myself in the foot. So I rewrote the book, having worked this out, and it was my voice. And I finally sold that book, which then catapulted me into a completely new world. So when I sold that first medical romance, a man said to me, when are you going to write a real book? And he was lucky that he didn't wear the drink I was holding, because I had written a real book. And at that time, I struggled to imagine being able to write another one, let alone writing something completely in a different genre or substantially longer than this 50,000-word novel. But when you sell a book, publishers expect you to write another one. And so I wrote 6 medical romances. I got an urge to stretch new writing muscles. I was trying to break into the American market because there are a lot more readers over there. And so I wrote a book called Boomerang Bride, based around my time that we had been living in America. But I finished that just as the global financial crisis hit in 2010. And I sent it off to 36 agents. That would 5 of them rejected it. Then I got the agent, and it went to 12 print publishing houses, and they rejected it. And then this is 2010, 2011, you have to understand there was this new thing called an ebook. And I did not want my book to be published as an ebook only, because they don't pay advances. But but it was too good to sit on my computer. I really believed in it. So I sent it off to Harlequin, to their digital first arm, because they're a big publishing house. And I said to my husband, they'll publish this because I really don't want to sell it this way. And that's exactly what happened. They did. But what this offered me was, they said, we will publish 12 copies of this book so you can enter the Rita. Well, this is the biggest romance writers competition in America. And so I entered it and didn't think very much of it. And cut a long story short, I ended up winning with Boomerang Bride. And what that did was it catapulted me into another level. I got a new agent, and I wrote 3 more books, and I got a print contract from Penguin America, which I thought was the bee's knees. I thought, this is it. And I planned a series of 7 romances, medical romances set in Montana, and they're the first 2. So this is in 2015, and Random House and Penguin merged, and I lost my editor. The line completely vanished in the reshuffle, and suddenly I was homeless again. So I was, as far as the writer's journey, I was back in the abyss of despair again, and I had to fight my way through to the transformation level. So I decided to return to writing books set in Australia, and once again I had a desire to stretch my writing wings and not be tied into a happy ever after. And so I wrote my first big family saga, Daughter of Mine, a multi-generational novel set in my back garden of Western Victoria, which we sold to HarperCollins Australia. And I've gone on to write 4, and but again, it's a constant circle being an author. So although these books are best-selling in Australia and have done very well, we haven't been able to sell them into the United States. So just recently I own the rights to these books for the rest of the world outside Australia and New Zealand. So we have just recently self-published them into the rest of the world, and they're the covers underneath that have gone to the rest of the world. And so I am back learning all sorts of new things now, still transforming with things like marketing and Amazon ads and all sorts of different things. So another call to adventure, and another moments in the pit of despair, and more moments where things are fantastic. So that is my story. So, I'm an overnight sensation after, 10 years of really hard work. So how does my story help you? Well, let's talk about getting started. So it's really, really important to write what you know. It's much easier to write what you know than to force yourself into a niche that isn't comfortable. There are some really best-selling niches, but I cannot write crime. I get palpitations just reading a psychological thriller. I'm the person who watches Rear Window like this. So that's not ever going to be my genre, and I can't force myself into that niche. So think about what you really enjoy to read, and that's probably the sort of book you will most comfortably want to write. Talking about genre, do decide your genre, have a think about that. Obviously, if you don't feel like me, I can't write crime, so that's not going to happen. But you do need to write something that's marketable, because if you straddle genres, publishing houses don't know how to market it. And so you can have a really well-written book that's fantastic, but they will reject you because they can't fit it into a distinct area. And a friend of mine, that happened to her last year, absolutely fantastic book, which you can purchase as an ebook. She's self-published now, called Jane Austen's Ghost. But it kind of straddles the traditional marketplaces for books. So that was why it wasn't picked up by a big publishing house. Don't be like me and decide to write a book and not even know how to format a document. I sent my first one in single spaced. You never do that to an editor. It has to be double spaced. So do have a basic understanding of Word, know about your margins, double space your manuscript. The standard is Times New Roman, 25 lines exactly on the page on an A4. Depending on who you're writing for, Word automatically defaults to American English. So if you're writing for an Australian publishing house, change your language to Australian so you're sending off the right spelling. It's all these little things really do make a difference. That said, if it's a great story, it will be picked up. But yeah, you don't want to give them any excuse not to pick you up out of the slush pile. And sure, write by freehand if you want. Some people do their first drafts writing by hand in a exercise book. Don't lose the book. I met an author recently who writes his first draft in a moleskin book, and he left it in the supermarket once. Fortunately, was able to find it. But at some point, you are going to have to transcribe that novel into a Word document or Scrivener or whatever. You're going to have to know your way around and be able to type it in. So it can be read by the agent or the publisher that's going to buy your novel. When you're planning your novel, you want to be looking at developing your characters. You want to make them multifaceted. Think about the characters that have stuck with you when you've been reading your favourite books. They're generally the one with quirks. In my next novel, I've got a bloke who has a quote for every situation, and I had a lot of fun with that. Take the really uptight character, the one that has got everything absolutely organised all of the time, but give them a quirk that will go against everything that's expected of them. So have a bit of fun with your characters. But remember to make them human. No one is perfect and no one is totally evil either. In my most recent novel, Just an Ordinary Family, I wrote about female friendship, and there's one person who feels utterly betrayed, but the other friend doesn't see it as a betrayal at all. So, you're wanting to write about real people, make them three-dimensional. When you're starting your novel, it's really important that you know what those characters believe about themselves, because this will give you their character arc. Characters in a good story and a page-turning story, the characters are going to change across the course of the novel. They are not going to finish the novel in the same place that they started. Well, sometimes they might, but I find those more of a dull read. I like to see some character growth. So in my novels, the character will always finish the book in a completely different place, emotionally from where they started. So in Home Fires, which was my my bushfire novel, a bushfire has razed the town, and Claire starts the novel no longer trusting the future, and because of that, she no longer believes that she is going to live her life in a particular way that she believed before the fires. So when writing the book, I threw her face to face with that belief constantly, and she grew and changed as a person. Remember those challenges in the hero's journey? Well, that's what you want to be showing your characters. They need to face their own fears so that they can learn. But we're pretty slow to learn, human beings. We don't like change, and we want to cling to the past. So we normally have to come up against a few challenges before we are forced kicking and screaming to see ourselves in a new light. So that's what gives you your character arc. And a great character arc gives the reader the payoff. they're rooting for the character. You really want your readers to walk in your character's shoes and to share that journey. And as readers, we do this because it's quite safe. We could leap off the cliff with the character and know that we're not going to come to harm, even though the character is in peril. And so we enjoy the story from that point of view. Now, a great character arc, as I said, will give you the payoff. I normally know my character's arcs before I start writing the actual book, but sometimes I might be a little bit hazy and it firms up during the writing process. But what I do know when I start a novel is what the character believes about themselves. And what we believe about ourselves can be completely incorrect, or it can be correct. Think about that person who thinks they're overweight when we can see they're really underweight, the person who doesn't believe they're attractive and yet we see that they are. So what we believe about ourselves is our truth, even if it's not correct. And that truth influences everything we say, everything we do, and how we react to other people and how we react in every situation. So if you know that about your character, you can drop them anywhere and know exactly how they will react. And that's important. You need to be in your character's head and staying true to them as you write them. So now what have I said here? Develop your setting. Okay, so with setting, I have set all of these last 4 books in Victoria. The next one I'm sitting in Tasmania just for something a little bit different. I always visit the area that I am setting a book in. I write contemporary novels, so I always visit the area. I create a fictitious town, but I set it in a real area. So in Daughter of Mine, I set that in the Western Districts, and so I referenced Colac and I referenced Geelong, but I created the town because if I had set it in Colac, someone would say to me, there's not a service station on that intersection. So I can do whatever I want. I can have the park and the school anywhere I want, but I centre it in a real place. If you're writing fantasy and you're world building, then you're creating a whole galaxy, I really recommend that you draw it, build it in Lego, whatever, so that you really are there and can really picture it and you know where things are. I'm not a sci-fi science fiction-y person, but world building, whether you are making up an entire world or whether you are building a fictitious one rooted in reality, you need to be really familiar with it, and then you can comfortably write in it. So choose your point of view. I referenced that when I first started writing, I didn't even know what a point of view was. Point of view is this character who is telling the story from. So there's first and second and third person points of view. Personally, for a novel, first and third work best. That's my opinion. I feel second person puts a wall between you and your reader, and you really don't want that. You want your reader to be with you the whole way. And I read a book recently that had all 3 points of view. So there were 3 characters. One was always, their story was always told in first. The second character was told in second, and the third character was told in third. And of the 3 characters, the one that told in second person did not bond at all. So I don't advise that you use second, but, then again, it's your book. So, and there's no rules, which for a person like me who likes the rules, I find this really frustrating. But normally I would avoid third person present because it's a very agitating way to tell a story for a reader, and it's all telling rather than showing, and we want to show. We want to show is how showing the story is how you get the emotion and how you pull people in. But that said, and that's what I normally do, I normally use third person, and I third person past, and I show and I pull in a lot of emotion. But in Home Fires, I really, really wanted to write the fire in third person present for that sheer agitating way, because it is absolutely terrifying to be caught in a bushfire, and I wanted that to come across. So there's one chapter in the book that is written in third person present because it was necessary for the book, and I think it added to it. So there's always a rule to be broken. All righty. So writing, okie dokie. So all these, value the work, commit to writing and creating the time, are all tied. I really strongly urge, if you want to write a novel, a memoir, any non-fiction, anything, if you want to write anything, you need to value the work. And this is your line in the sand. If you value it and make it a priority, those around you will also understand and value it. If you put it last, so will everyone else, and you will never get any words written. So when that voice in your head says, I'm never going to find the time to write this book, I want you to listen to this. If you write 500 words 5 days a week for 48 weeks, you'll have a novel. And normally when you set out to write those 500 words, you will exceed them. Quite a few years ago, I used to come up to a writing group in Melbourne, and there was a group of women. Many of them had started a lot of books, started way more books than I'd ever started, but they finished none, because they would get this shiny new idea that always came to them right when they were in the middle of the book. Middles are the swampy, sucking mud of a novel. That's when it's really hard. You're trying to keep it interesting and you don't know what you're doing, and that's when a lot of people will just set it aside because there's this great new idea over here. Write me. So I got these women to bank a chapter a month with me on the 29th of each month. They would just email me their chapter, and that was their deadline. And at the end of the year, they'd all written a first draft. Now, I didn't read a single word of their work, but they knew that if they didn't attach a Word document of their chapter on an email on the 29th, they'd get a "where is it" email from me. And so at the end of that year, they all had finished their first book, and it was really exciting. So find a way that works for you. I mean, some people need that carrot. They need that motivation. Other people don't. But find what works for you and stick to it. Commit to the work. And creating the time. Well, yeah, here's a challenge. When I was writing, I also had another job. I would get up at 5:30 in the morning before everyone else, and I would write for an hour before the household woke up. Got little tiny kids, write when they nap. Get up early or write when they're in bed. Retired partner, decided that, you're going to write now. Retired partner, tell them you're unavailable between the hours of whatever suits you best. Close the office door. Send them out for a walk. Do something, make it important, create that time. And I really can't stress enough, if you don't value it, no one else will value it. And believe me, there is always a reason not to write, always. Even when you're contracted, there's always a reason. Oh, look over there, the oven needs cleaning because the book's not working today. So, create the time to write. To developing your skills, you can't recommend strongly enough that you study those books you read and loved and you literally inhaled. Those ones that you burnt dinner for and stayed up and reading until 3 a.m. Go back, read them. Get an old copy, not your treasured copy. Find one from the op shop and highlight the conflicts, highlight the moments that made you gasp, highlights when you were surprised, and those sentences that played over and over, and analyse it. You learn so much by reading the works of the people that you love. You really do. You need to do some writing workshops. There's that saying about there's a book in everyone, and that may be true, but we do need help. there are certain structures, there's ways of forming sentences that you need to learn, and the craft of writing, so that you can get that tension, so you can write fantastic, complex characters that your readers want to turn the page to find out what's going to happen next. There are some people who will write that first novel without any help, but they're really few and far between. Most of us go off and do some courses. And the great thing about doing courses is you also meet other writers. Actually kind of meet your tribe, because writers can, like anyone with a hobby, when you meet someone else with that same passion, it's really exciting and they understand you. So Writers Victoria is a really great resource, and if you're writing romance, the Romance Writers of Australia, there's also a crime group. Get online and do some Googling. You do need to edit your work. All the bestsellers, everyone has an editor, and sometimes that wonderful piece of writing has to go because it doesn't fit. And if it hurts too much, cut and paste, park it in another document. And I used to do that a lot, and I never, ever went back and used those beautiful words. But it makes you feel better. It's easier at the start to do that. And join a writers group. As I said, Writers Victoria, or go for your genre. There's sci-fi, there's the Historical Novelist Association, there's RWA. Choose a beta reader carefully. That is someone who reads your work to tell you whether they think it's working or not. You need to choose someone who likes to read what you like to read. So your best friend mightn't be the best person for you if his or her reading tastes are completely different from yours. So find someone who enjoys the style of book you're writing and ask them to read it. Getting feedback is hard at first. As time goes by, you develop the heart of a rhinoceros. Don't read reviews. But get some tips. See if people think that they want to keep reading more. That's always helpful, and it keeps you going. And polish, and submit your work. And so that is a very brief overview, but it gives you a starting block of what you can do to get your career off and running and getting those first words written. So I'm going to turn off my PowerPoint presentation and come back to see you a little bit bigger on the screen.
Fiona, thank you so much for that. That was really a great introduction to how to have a career as a writer. So we have a little bit of time now for some questions, and we have had several that have come in. The first one, I think you might have answered this of your introductory remarks, but perhaps I'll just ask it anyway because I think the answer is pretty impressive. So it's a simple question. How many books have you written?
36.
36.
Well, I'm about to start I've written 35. The 35th comes out in March, and I've written the first chapter of the 36th, which is June next April.
Wow. So that's really a career.
Yeah.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much. All right. And another question that's come in is, where is the best place to start to learn about formatting a novel?
Formatting, as in for self-publishing? Okay, well, there are some great programs out there that do it for you. I did a short story and I learnt how to do the HTML and all that, and it was a complete nightmare. I use a program called Vellum, which is fairly expensive, but because I'm self-publishing at least 10 novels, it was worth purchasing. I think it was about $350, Vellum, and it is the most amazing thing. All you need to do is have a super clean Word document, and you upload it into Vellum, and it takes about 35 seconds, and you have the most beautiful book. And then you just go in and add your links, and then your book is ready to go when you've got a designer for the cover. But there are courses out there, and there are free programs. I think Readsy does formatting, and there are people you can pay. So just do a bit of Googling. I think Writers Victoria, coming up soon, has a workshop about self-publishing.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. And on a completely other topic, what do you think about novels that switch between lots and lots of different characters' points of view? So not just 2 or 3, I think the question is asking, but many.
Okay, I'm not quite sure if that's asking within the same scene. If you're changing points of view in the same scene between lots of different people, that's called head hopping, and it can leave the reader like having no idea who's actually talking or whose head they're in. So some very famous, huge selling authors have always head hopped and it hasn't hurt their career any. Other people will say that it steals all possibility of building tension and building the emotion in the scene. Home Fires has been written from 5 points of view, but I stick to 1 point of view per scene, but there are 4 women and 1 male, and you get the 5 points of view. I think that it doesn't matter how many, if it's a dedicated scene and it's clearly the first 3 sentences at the start of the scene tell you and center you, then the reader will be fine. But if you're trying to write a story with more, this was my biggest challenge. I'd never done 5 points of view. And look, see the size of the book? You're not going to get away with a small story. The more points of view you're telling, the bigger the story.
We might have just lost you there for a moment, Fiona.
Oh, sorry, what was the last thing I said?
So when you went to hold the book up, at that point you went mute for a few moments.
Okay, so I was just saying Home Fires was written from 5 points of view, 4 women and 1 male, but each scene was written from 1 point of view. But if you're going to write a whole book from a lot of points of view, and I certainly wouldn't recommend, I'll never do 5 again, ever. I'm trying to do 3 because you end up with giant books. That's the only other thing. But as long as you centre and start your scene very clearly in whose point of view it is and stick to it, then it's fine.
Thank you. It's reminding me of some books that I have read, some very accomplished works like The Luminaries, which was written to view, and I did enjoy it a lot, but you certainly needed to be going back to the list. I think there was a list of characters at the front of the book, and you certainly, especially if you put the book down for a while and then picked it up again, you certainly needed to be refreshing your mind about, you know, which character was which. So yeah, certainly, and I just always thought, how does the author keep it straight, you know? So it's interesting, but some books that have been written like that have actually been very, very good to read, but I can imagine very complicated for the author to write. Fiona, we've had one last question come in, and that is, do people ever say that they recognise themselves in your books, and has that ever been a problem?
People do say that, so I have never written anybody in particular. My characters are always a collection of, you know, made up different things. In my books, there is always a line written for my extended family. It'll be a family saying, it'll be a children's toy, it'll be something that they will recognise is particularly us, but that's not a character. That's just a bit of a, you know, a bit of a joke. In Daughter of Mine, someone said to me, oh, you know, you wrote that such and such, and I said, no, it isn't. It's just that certain people have certain traits. So no. And at the front of my book, it says this is a work of fiction. And this is names, characters, places, and incidents are the product of the author's imagination, are used fictitiously, and any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, business establishments, events, or locale is purely coincidental, and that's the absolute truth. Yeah, I don't write memoir, I don't write biography, so you're only going to get into trouble if you are actually writing about a real person and you hardly change it. Then you're going to get into, and then you'll get into strife.
Right. So that's always been an interesting question for me as well, actually, to the extent to which a writer will write from people that they know, and then, it obviously must be a bit tricky if people do start to recognise themselves in the books.
Yeah.
All right. If I might just sort of take a captain's pick and maybe just throw in one question myself, if that's okay. I'm just wondering, when you get to the end of a particular book and it's about to be published, and you know that the books are all going to hit the bookshops in another week sort of thing, do you get really excited? Is that a really sort of excited and satisfying moment? Or are you already kind of thinking it's kind of done and dusted and you don't really care about it anymore?
When you get the box of books arrives and you're actually holding it in your hand, and I don't know if you can see but with Home Fires, can you see the gold foil kind of, sparkling? When you're holding that book in your hand, because it leaves you always as a Word document, and even when you see it as just as a stack of papers. So no, that never gets old, holding the book. But when my books come out in early March, and normally there's a contracted book that's due in April. So my launch month is always really complicated. I will be out on the road doing, back in the day, before COVID, I was allowed out on the road with people, and then scurrying home and trying to concentrate and be creative. And your marketing, touring, talking about the work is completely different from the creative side. But no, it's very exciting when you actually see the book. I'm not a smeller of books, but a lot of people really love the smell of books. But I like to, see. I'm still surprised that I wrote it. Like when I see it, I think, oh man, did I actually write that? So yeah.
So you don't mind, because I think some people will say that they love the part of it, but they don't love the promotional part of it. But it sounds like you're quite happy with the promotional part as well, getting out there and spruiking it.
I love hearing from readers, and they tell you all sorts of interesting things. I was very humbled when I did the Home Fires tour, because people came up to me and said that they'd lived through fires, and that they felt that I had done it really well. And so, and I heard one awful story of one lady who had moved out of one particular fire zone and been burnt out and relocated, and then 10 years later was burnt out again. So yeah, I like chatting to people, and the more people you meet, the more little vignettes you hear, you can, you think, oh, I might put that in a book.
Wow. And all right, Fiona, it's probably time for us to wrap up. So I believe you have a new book coming out in March 2021. Is that right?
I do. I've got A Home Like Ours, which is going to be set up on the Murray River, and it's about a small town and a community garden, and it's got themes of displacement run through it. So we're looking at 4 women's very different lives, and they all intersect through the community garden. And I think you said you've got Just an Ordinary Family. That's the one that came out in March, and through Borrow Box. It's also on a super sale at the moment as an ebook. So if you didn't want to wait for the library, you can get your own copy. I think it's $3.99 just about everywhere. And the audio edition is absolutely fantastic through BorrowBox app. And I've been really lucky that Rebecca McCauley has narrated all my 4 big books, and she does an amazing job, especially I have a cast of characters, you know, like there's an awful lot of characters, and she manages to do so many different voices. So I love audiobooks. So, yeah, I recommend that.
So lovely. Thank you so much, Fiona. I do apologise to everybody that we had some little technical hitches at the start, which got us off to a bit of a late start. We've just run over 7:30 now, so it might be time for us to wind up. So I would like to extend a very warm thank you to you, Fiona, for being here with us tonight, and also to everybody who's joined in to listen to this presentation. We do expect, as I mentioned before, we have recorded the talk, and we do hope to be able to pop it up on our YouTube. So if you do know of anybody who would have liked to have been here but couldn't, just keep an eye out on Kingston Library's YouTube channel, and hopefully we'll have it up before too long. So just thank you again, everybody, and we look forward to catching up with you at another event soon. And thank you again, Fiona.
Thanks for having me. Good night.
Good night.